Good day traders, welcome to this week's RMD Weekly Market Overview. It's been another big week in the markets with a lot of big moves playing out as per our video last week. This week will no doubt be even bigger, especially considering what happens tomorrow in the US. Remember to keep safe out there and make some notes as I'm expecting some excellent opportunities this week. I'm now going to let the disclaimer roll and I will see you back in the charts. As always, we start with the US dollar to South African rand. Last week saw our short target at 1604 quickly realized, after which we saw a pullback. And as also mentioned last week, the area between the weekly pivot and the monthly pivot at 1626 to 1635 did indeed act as resistance. And from there, we then saw another leg down. And currently, considering that price is now closed below the monthly S2 pivot at 1566, that would open up the area of support, which is also our next pivot support, and that is the area between the weekly S1 pivot at 1528 and the monthly S3 pivot at 1523. Also, it's worth noting that there's a good chance that we should see a pullback to the weekly pivot at 1585. And of course, there would be this area of resistance in between the weekly and monthly S1 pivot. Only if price manages to break above the monthly S1 pivot at 1594 could it perhaps open up new bullish targets, which could include this weekly R1 pivot at 1614 and perhaps even this area between the monthly pivot at 1636 and the yearly R2 at 1655. Moving on now to the Euro USD. Last week saw the price area of 1.162. This was a very important area of support being tested, and luckily that area then held up, and that was also due to some additional assistance from the daily 100 SMA, which I've projected here again on our 4-hour time frame. From there, as soon as price managed to break above the monthly pivot at 1.172, we saw this rally, which ended in price closing at 1.187 on Friday. This would mean that there is definitely still some scope a bit higher. As you can see, the immediate area of overhead resistance would be at the yearly R2 at 1.191. And then, of course, the area of, let's say, major resistance would be in the area between 1.196 and 1.197. That's the area between the weekly R1 pivot and monthly R2 pivot, and also the area of additional confluence from this overhead diagonal. Also worth noting that the area of support for this week would be our monthly R1 and weekly pivot. Those are both in this area highlighted in red, and that is between 1.171 and 1.180. And that means that if price were to move back into this area, find some support, we can expect that next leg up. Of course, also if it were to be that price breaks below this weekly pivot, the next areas of support would again be our monthly pivot at 1.172 and this daily 100 SMA that is projected over here. Then just a brief look at the economic calendar for the week. We can see that later today we have the European Central Bank President speaking, and then at 12:35 the Bank of England Governor speaking. Then on Tuesday there's no events scheduled. On Wednesday a few events affecting New Zealand. On Thursday, there's CPI figures and unemployment claims. And on Friday, we have core PPI. And of course, we have the preliminary consumer sentiment reports at 5. And we're now looking at the GBPUSD. Last week, we mentioned that the daily 100 SMA near this important 1.285 level, which was also last week's S1 pivot, would be an important area of support with a break above the monthly pivot, possibly taking us to the monthly R1 at 1.314. That is indeed what we then saw happening. So you are also welcome to go have a look at the video from last week and see how that actually played out according to our analysis. And for this week, I'm expecting a possible move higher again, with the first target at the weekly R1 pivot at 1.326, and then an additional secondary target in between this area of 1.333 and 1.338, which is the monthly R2 pivot and the weekly R2 pivot, and those are both finding some additional area of confluence from our overhead diagonal. So that would be the area of resistance. Considering an area of immediate support, this would be the weekly pivot at 1.305, meaning if price were to move back into this area, it's possible that we can see another move higher towards those target areas. However, if price were to break below the weekly pivot at 1.305, the areas of support would be this weekly pivot, this monthly pivot at 1.297, and perhaps a bit lower, where we will find some additional support from the 4-hour 200 SMA and also this daily 100 SMA, which I've projected, all coming together on the weekly S1 pivot at 1.294. Moving on now to the Australian dollar USD. Last week we mentioned the importance of keeping a close eye on this 4-hour 200 SMA, and of course also this level at 0.712, which was then an area of resistance. We can see that price managed to break above that level and also managed to get above the 4-hour 200 SMA, and that then allowed this rally to play out. And currently we can see that we have some consolidation on this area of resistance at 0.727. This does appear to be somewhat of a pull flag formation, meaning there could be a second leg up. And just considering a possible target area, the area between the monthly R1 pivot at 0.733 and 0.736, which is, as you can see, the weekly and monthly R1 pivots, that would be an area of resistance. Also, just considering that should there be a pullback, the area to look out for some support would be this area of 0.718. That is where we meet the weekly pivot as well as the monthly R1 pivots. And that's also that important area of support, which used to be resistance. So that would be a potentially new bullish channel that would be forming should we find some support here and move back higher into these levels. Looking now at the NASDAQ 100. Last week we made reference to the fact that should price manage to break above the important 11,500 level, bullish targets would then include this area between the monthly R1 pivot at 11,923 and 12,000. And as we can see, that is very near to where price is currently trading. Price is currently up against major diagonal resistance as well. This is the line that we have here in blue. And that means that there could be some further consolidation or perhaps even a retest of this area of the weekly pivot at 11,740. We can also see that we have our 50, 100 and 200 SMAs on the 4-hour all converging just below this level. But just considering this 11,675 area to 11,040 area to be support, that means that any bullish price action from this could see another attempt at this overhead diagonal resistance, and a break above that could then realize bullish targets of 12,506, which is the weekly R1 pivot, or perhaps even these additional two targets at 12,742 to 12,910. That is the monthly R2 and the weekly R2 pivots. In a bearish scenario where price breaks below the weekly pivot, it's possible that price can then move back into the monthly pivot area at 11,450. And if there is a bigger sell-off, then support will be found at this area at the monthly S1 pivot at 10,690. Moving on now to Brent crude oil. Price is struggling to break through this 4-hour 200 and 100 SMAs, currently acting as resistance. And at this moment, price is finding some support at the monthly pivot at 39.60. And only if price can break above this 4-hour 200 SMA and manage to move into this area of the monthly R1 pivot at 42, could we potentially see moves higher. And again, also worth noting that there is this additional strong area of overhead diagonal resistance around 43. So those would all be areas of resistance. If price breaks below this area of support, which is the area between our weekly pivot and monthly pivot at 39.50 to 39.60, that could mean price will continue to move lower into the area of support, which could perhaps be anything from 38 to this area at 37, which is the weekly S1 pivot. There are some additional area of support, but just keep an eye on price action, especially in this area between the two pivots at the weekly and monthly. Moving on now to gold. Last week we mentioned that should gold manage to get back above this very important level of 1,095 to 1,006, that this would be considered very bullish. And currently price is trading just above the weekly pivot at around 1950, and the last breakout considering the previous two highs, as you can see, would all converge on this level at 1928, which is the current weekly pivot and the current area of support. If we do see some bullish price action from this level, we can perhaps see new bullish targets at the monthly RT pivot at 1963, followed by the weekly R1 pivot at 1983, and that will also be very close to where we converge with this very important psychological level of 2000, which is also the monthly R3 level. If, however, price were to break below this area of support of 1920, it will again find some strong support at this 1905 level, as this is where we will see the 4-hour, 50 and 100 SMAs all converging on this previous area of support. And finally, we conclude once again with Bitcoin. Last week was another impressive week for Bitcoin, with price making a new high for the year in between the monthly R1 and monthly R2 pivots at 15,968. Obviously, the trend remains very bullish despite a pullback on Friday. There is support at 14,200, and that is where we had this horizontal support as well as this diagonal support, and that means we still have some scope for a move higher towards the monthly R2 pivot at 16,500. If, however, price breaks below 14,200, I do expect some additional support on 13,500, which is another diagonal level and also very close to where we have our weekly S1. I trust you found value in this week's video. As always, please remember to subscribe, and if you would be interested in receiving trade setup ideas throughout the week, or if you would be interested in getting access to our free masterclass series, just go to our website www.rmdtrader.com to sign up quickly and easily. Until next time, this is John Jacobs for RMD Trader. Trade smart and trade successful.